He's
Right, you're live.
You're live.
Good luck.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Richard, we got as far as your birth in Shanghai and movement to Hong Kong, but let's go further from there, can't we?
Don't you want to start again from the beginning so that we have one continuous program?
Yeah.
Okay, right, yeah. So what should we do then?
Start.
Yeah, just introduce me.
Right. Good morning, everybody. This is Stuart Dalby in Black Horse. Talking to my guest, Richard Pordes. Richard is a very good friend of mine from university days, and he's had a very, very interesting life. And after university, he's had a very interesting life. So it would be very nice to know where you were born and what was your really childhood like. What was your childhood like, or what was?
Okay.
Yeah.
I can take it from there, Stuart. Thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be with you. As you said, we've only seen each other on and off occasionally since university days, but the bond is still there, and it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be able to call you my friend. So let me start off a little bit before my birth, because actually my parents had a much more interesting life even than I think I've had. And I think it may be of interest to your viewers to hear a little bit about their story and how I came into being. So both my parents were living in Vienna in the 1930s as teenagers. And when 1938 came along, as you'll probably all know, Austria was annexed by Germany thanks to an Austrian called Adolf Hitler. And as you can imagine, for many people in Austria, not just Jews, but people with all kinds of backgrounds that were not Aryans, this was a terrible blow. And at least the young people realized that they would have to get out of the country, that staying in the country was no longer a viable life solution for them. So my mother was very lucky in that she was a kindergarten teacher. She was able to get a job through a friend of hers, being the nanny to the children of the Indian consul general to New York. And he was looking for an Austrian nanny to look after his kids. Maybe he had heard the story of Austrian nannies taking care of families. Anyway, she was hired and flew to London, where she joined this Indian family on the Queen Mary, I think it was, to take the journey over to the United States. So that was how she was able to get out of Austria. However, after about a year in the vicinity of New York, in the suburbs of New York, looking after this Indian gentleman's children, she really had enough. She wasn't really interested in being a nanny. She was trained as a kindergarten teacher. So she decided to leave and join her boyfriend, who at that time was already in China, having been a student of Chinese affairs. And my father, on the other hand, and they had not met at that time, went to Denmark, where he had a cousin who was living and working in Copenhagen. And at that time, at the beginning, the late 1930s, actually before the war had started, it was still safe for Jews and undesirable people like him to be in Denmark. However, after a couple of years in Denmark, and the German occupation of Denmark, which took place with virtually no resistance from the Danes. Of course, they didn't have a chance against a huge army like the Nazi German army. Anyway, it became unsafe for him to stay in Copenhagen, so he also left Europe, and he decided to go to Shanghai. The reason being that in Shanghai, though Shanghai was an international city in those days, with a British area, a French area, an American area. It was pretty much divided among the Western powers. So one could travel to Shanghai without a visa and settle down in one of the foreign colonies, I should say, of Shanghai. My mother, in the meantime, had taken the journey across the Pacific. She went across the Pacific from Vancouver in a tramp steamer and joined her fiancé in Shanghai. And they were able to survive there with about 30,000 other expats who had ended up in Shanghai, because it was a well-known fact in those days that this was one place you could go to without a visa. It was, of course, very difficult to get a visa, if you could get it at all, to come to the United States or even to go to one of the South American countries, though many people did succeed in going to places like Brazil and Argentina. Anyway, here they were in Shanghai. They met and got married and actually lived through some pretty horrific times. First, they were bombed by the Japanese, then they were bombed by the Americans, but they survived it all. And at the end of the war, I was born, and we stayed in Shanghai for 3 or 4 years, but it then became unviable for Europeans to stay in China, with Mao Zedong taking over the country. And probably Europeans would have been okay, but no one wanted to take the risk. So my parents left and moved to Hong Kong, where my father was able to get a job as the representative of the Austrian government for trade matters. He was the trade representative. He started his own business in Hong Kong, basically importing and exporting whatever came along, mainly pharmaceuticals. And so I grew up in Hong Kong. Hong Kong at that time, as you may know, was a British colony. So I went through the British school system and was very grateful to have benefited from an excellent British education. So I knew all about the history of England and about all the wars that Britain won. I never, of course, heard about anything about the wars that Britain lost. But that's the same, I think, for every country when you study the history of that country. So by the time I reached the age of 14, it was about time for us kids, and I'm talking about my contemporaries in the British school, who were from all kinds of different countries, including local Hong Kong Chinese. It was time for us to be sent to boarding school to have this great education that we couldn't get in Hong Kong. And of course, that great education that we all received by going back to our home countries, whether it's England or Switzerland or Austria or Germany, Scandinavia, whatever, that great education that we received all sentenced us to a life of work and misery. Whereas my Chinese colleagues who I'd grown up with in Hong Kong stayed in Hong Kong. Of course, they didn't have anywhere to go to. For their study, they went to the University of Hong Kong. And of course, the result is that I and all my colleagues, my expat colleagues from Hong Kong, ended up being working stiffs like you and I, Stuart, whereas all our colleagues who stayed in Hong Kong became billionaires. So that was another bad decision of our parents, to send us overseas for an education. But no matter what, here we are. I ended up getting a degree from the University of Sussex, as you did, Stuart.
Yeah,
Uh, I
you
was then
mentioned Beatles before there, didn't you? You
to the
mentioned that.
United States.
Beatles
Sorry?
was a progressive school, wasn't it?
Oh, well, yes. Going back to England, I was lucky enough to be sent by my parents to a place called Bedales, which is and was a progressive boarding school, co-educational boarding school, beautifully situated in the on the South Downs of Hampshire. In fact, I'll be going back to Petersfield next week for a small mini reunion of my friends who all went to Bedales with me.
Yeah, some of them dropped off, of course. You remember Roger Hopper?
Yes,
He
yes, I
was a
do.
very successful actor in Britain.
Yes, I
Wonderful
know.
things.
Yeah,
I can't. He was in Fools and Horses and all those kind of things, wasn't he?
right.
And I always remember him. They
Yeah,
was talking about. They were talking about the who was the Indian chief? What was his name?
I remember seeing him on a series on a television series where he played a very I don't know a very rural farmer. And of course, he had his accents down beautifully. And yes, as you say, he was a brilliant actor, and not just uh, not just a movie star type of actor, but an actor who could really act and play different parts.
Well, who was the great Indian leader? Not Nehru.
Gandhi.
Huh?
Gandhi.
Gandhi. Yeah. So they were talking. Roger. We're talking about films, and so no, he was talking about Gandhi. I said, oh well, he can't be much. He's only been in one film.
Right. Well, Stuart, you and I had contacts, with some very famous people. I remember going frequently to the bar in the Students' Union at Sussex and seeing Thabo Mbeki sitting at a table surrounded by a group of South African colleagues plotting the overthrow of the South African government.
Yeah, quite so. Yeah.
So there we were, just inches away from modern history.
And Kenneth Coanda, he got the what's it? Not the what did he? He got fellow of Sussex University or something like that.
Yeah, he was the president of Zambia, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, if you want me to continue, I ended up doing my graduate degree at Columbia University in New York. I was very lucky to receive a fellowship from the English-speaking Union, which was an organization that Winston Churchill, I think, started. And it was like a reverse, what do they call it? Not Marshall Plan, but it was an exchange program for British students to go and study in America. And they selected about 100 graduates every year that they would bring over to the United States and study at American universities. So I took advantage of that and was very
that's
lucky.
very interesting, Richard, because even to this day, the new Vice Chancellor is made biodiversity a frontline thing they will do. And I'm a member of the Alumni Society,
Right.
and I actually support the alumni because the money we give to the Royal offer someone like a lady who's having a baby and can't afford to take up her course. And the thing about it's not like an Oxbridge or well, at Oxbridge, or what are the middle ones called? Nottingham are called, or Red Brick. We were a plate glass university, weren't we?
Right.
Whereupon we were prepared to actually take all kinds of people in and look after them, basically. As you say, Mbeki, South African. Where did he come for his education? And
Yeah, I would say that most of his education was in the bar, not in the classroom.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, he was very rude about the women as well.
Was he?
Yeah, he was a funny little bloke. He really was. He was in the economics thing, wasn't he? The special branch. I can't think what it's called.
Right. Well, he was a reasonably good president of South Africa, I think, much better than some of his successors.
Yeah.
Not as great, of course, as his predecessor, but I think he did a fairly good job. I don't know where he is now, if he's still alive or if he's retired. But
I think he's still alive.
Yeah. Anyway, so while I was at Columbia University, I applied for an internship at the United Nations, which was just across town. And again, being, I suppose, in the right place at the right time, was lucky to get the internship, and ended up being a press officer at the United Nations, reporting on the meetings and writing press releases and so on. And it was at that time when I was doing that service that I received a phone call from the 38th floor, which was the Secretary General's office. And lo and behold, it was the personal assistant to the Secretary General at that time, a fellow called Kurt Waldheim.
Yeah.
And he asked me if I'd like to join the team, the Kurt Waldheim team in the Secretary General's office. Being fortunate enough to speak German and English, I was bilingual, I still am bilingual in those languages, thanks to my mother. And so I ended up being actually an assistant to the Secretary General. And I would say that was probably the pinnacle of my career. From there on, it was a downhill spiral.
Wasn't there something wrong with Kurt Waldorf, though, or whatever it was?
Well, he was accused of being a Nazi. And I thought the accusation was a bit unfair. He had been drafted into the German army when he was 19 years old. He
Right,
was
Prince
not.
Philip here. Prince Philip was seen marching about, wasn't he?
He was not a member of the party. He just served in the German army. And unfortunately, he was posted to Yugoslavia, where a lot of atrocities were going on. And it's quite possible that he was involved in some of those atrocities. Anyway, I must say that he always treated me as a Jew very respectfully. And I never noticed any anti-Semitism coming from his side. In fact, I got to know his daughter and his son quite well, both of whom were living and working in New York, and were very nice people, unassuming and hardworking.
Yeah. Well,
So
we're having a terrible anti-Semitic
yeah,
at the moment here. You wouldn't believe
yeah.
what's
Well,
going on.
I know that's unfortunate, and that's because of the ridiculous policies being carried out by Benjamin Netanyahu, who, in my opinion, is the exact opposite of a good Israeli or a good Jew. He's an extremist, and he's doing pretty much the same thing that Trump is doing. He's perpetuating a war and perpetuating his premiership in order to stay out of jail. And unfortunately, democracies have that problem. Democracies seem to allow extremists to get into power, and then to basically harness, the reins of government to their own purposes rather than to the interests of their country. And I think that Netanyahu is completely destroying and damaging the reputation of Israel. And I'm afraid Israel and the Israelis are going to, and Jews around the world, are going to be the brunt of the criticism that really should be directed narrowly on someone like Netanyahu.
But I mean, my whole take on that issue you're talking about is that we have to go back to the Holocaust, didn't we?
Right.
And after that, after the Holocaust, there was quite a lot of Jews that went to America.
Yes.
Went to Boston and New York, for example, and this gave them extremely big voting power.
Well, I'm sorry, I would have to disagree with you on that. The populations of Jews in New York and Boston, I doubt that they exceed 10% of the population of those cities. I don't know the exact figures, but they're a very small minority, but they do happen to be quite influential because Jews who came to the United States were mainly very well educated, and their children were brought up to work hard and to study hard to be successful. So while it is true that there are many Jews in powerful positions in those two cities, to say that they have a majority or that they control the politics of that city, I think is totally wrong.
Yeah, but the point is that 10%, that America has to support Israel with arms and the rest. Otherwise, the president will lose his job.
I'm not sure if that's true again, but it is true that a lot of the president's financial supporters probably do come from the Jewish community. So I think it's more a fear of losing donations, political contributions, than it is a fear of losing votes. Because take the state of Michigan, for example. In the state of Michigan, I think there are 200,000 Arabic or Palestinian origin people living there, and they vote, of course, in the opposite direction. So it's a bit of a balancing act for people like President Biden and the Democrats, to walk a fine line between antagonizing the Arab Americans in Michigan, which is a key state for re-election, or
That's very
antagonizing
interesting. I
New
can't
York.
imagine that. I've not heard about that.
Oh,
Because
yes.
how do they get to Michigan?
There are 200,000 Palestinian and Arab Americans in Michigan, and Michigan, as you know, is a swing state. It's one of the 5 states that really determines who will be the president. And those 5 states, whoever wins those 5 states wins the presidency, because all the other states are already pretty much locked in on supporting either a Republican or a Democratic president.
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make is that America is such a diverse society that no matter what you do as a politician in America, someone is going to criticize you.
Yeah. But it's very, very interesting that always Jimmy Carter tried to make a solution, but he was the only person who did that, and it didn't work.
Right.
And the two states thing, it didn't work. But Hamas, on the other hand, they are absolutely determined to have the space that Israel has. They want a homeland for themselves. But unfortunately, Hamas, which claimed it was resistance fighters, are actually terrorism. So you've got terrorism within the Palestinian family, and that is a very, very difficult situation to sort of round off, if you see what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, again, the sad thing about Western democracy is that it's always the extremists that manage to maneuver themselves into positions of leverage where they have way more influence than their numbers, would justify. So, you've got Hamas, a small minority of the Palestinians, controlling the Palestinian side. You have Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing colleagues who are dominating Israeli politics. I mean, I have cousins in Israel, and they hate Netanyahu. They absolutely loathe him. And if they could, they would just get him out of office and put in a more moderate government. And until about 10 years ago, Israel did actually have moderate democratic governments. In fact, social democrats were ruling the country. But this has changed now, and I suppose it's the result of extremists on both sides getting into power and being able to politicize and what's the word? Weaponize, the political systems on their behalf and against the other side. It's an absolute tragedy, and I don't know how it can be reversed.
Yeah. Well, you know a great deal about American politics, and it's very interesting. You live in Connecticut now, don't you?
I do. Connecticut is, of course, a very democratic state and always votes for Democratic candidates. There's hardly a Republican Party in the state of Connecticut. It's very liberal.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. This about the Americans still getting behind the Israelis, but it seems that they need to do it.
Well, this morning or yesterday, I think it was, the leader of the Senate, I've forgotten his name right now, actually spoke out and called for an election in Israel to replace the current government. I don't know if that's going to do much good, because I assume that Netanyahu is the one who determines when the next election will take place, since they have a parliamentary system quite similar to the British parliamentary system. But eventually there will be an election. Eventually Netanyahu is almost certain to lose his job and probably will end up going to jail.
Yeah, with Trump.
Like Trump, it's amazing how similar the situations are. Actually, if you just look across the spectrum, you have people like Putin. If Putin lost his job, he'd go to jail. He'd probably be executed. And there are many countries like that. I think Bolsonaro is in Brazil is likely to go to jail soon. And as you know, a former prime minister of Israel has been in jail. So there are a lot of situations like that all over the world.
Yeah. So you think that Trump will get off with the charges against him?
I don't know. It's touch and go at the moment whether he will be tried before the election. But I am pretty certain that if there is a trial and if he is convicted before the election, there will be enough voters from the Republican Party switching over to the Democratic side and voting Democratic. So I think everything now depends on whether they can try and convict Trump before the election. That will make the difference as to who gets.
Yes, but the problem with that, Richard, is the highest court is packed with conservative codgers, apart from one woman, I think, and they are very, very right-wing, the whole lot of them.
Well, that's absolutely true, but you see what I think will happen, I hope will happen, is that they'll convict him. He will then, of course, appeal, but by the time the appeal gets heard and adjudicated upon, but by the time it goes up to the Supreme Court, the election will be over. So I think the important thing here is to get that first conviction, regardless of any appeals, because one conviction is enough, according to the current opinion polls. One conviction is enough to sway 5, 10, maybe even 15% of the voters away from Trump and towards Biden, and that will be the end of Trump. Once he loses the election, there's really no hope for him anymore. He will end up in jail. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah. I met Trump once, you know.
Oh yeah?
Well, you know, when he was trying to go a golf course up in Aberdeen,
Yeah,
and there was some little smallholder
yeah,
in the middle of it, and he couldn't get him out.
right.
So there was a press conference, and he shook my hand.
Yeah.
Boy, did I count my fingers afterwards? My made up thing about Trump was he was very greasy. I just felt he was very greasy. You know, you
Oh,
could
absolutely.
all over the place and all that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Well, you know, I have a neighbor living next door to me who is a building contractor. And he once made the mistake, which he regrets ever since, of accepting a contract from Trump. Fortunately, it was not a very large contract. It was just something minor. But Trump never paid him. And, you know, to this day, he says anyone who signs a contract with Trump is kidding themselves. They will never get paid.
Yeah. I mean, everything's wrong with him. He's racist, he's sexist, he's stupid.
The only thing I can say for him is that I once saw him. I didn't meet him. I saw him in his building in Trump Tower. I went in there to do some shopping, and he used to stand at the top of the escalator, just sort of with his arms folded, just kind of watching people or maybe waiting for visitors or something. I do have to say, this was, of course, about 20 years ago. I do have to say he's an impressive looking person. He's tall, over 6 feet tall. He used to be quite fit. He had this, you know, very thick crop of light brown golden hair. He did look impressive. He looked very presidential. But that's about as far as one could go, because everything he has done naturally is totally non-presidential.
Yes, he's not fit for that job, is he?
Well, he's so ignorant. He knows absolutely nothing about history. He knows nothing about contemporary affairs. He's a complete disaster. He thinks that he can run foreign policy by making friends, by being buddies, you know, with Putin and Kim Jong-un and all these people. He thinks that that is the way to keep them under control. And obviously, you know, that doesn't work. And they just think of him as, what do they call it? A convenient idiot. A useful idiot, sorry.
Yeah. Have you got any questions?
I'm fascinated going back. Your parents were subject to the dreadful anti-Semitism of their era.
Right.
I sometimes despair that the world goes forward. The same prejudices, perhaps not quite as above the parapet nowadays, but do you think that the world has learned from past experiences of the past sort of 70 or 80 years?
Well, that's a very good question. And I have a theory about that. And my theory is not that people are going to be less anti-Semitic or that people are going to learn from these experiences. But the hope that I do have today is that there are so many minorities in the world and so many minorities in each of our countries that it almost becomes impossible for the majority to dominate the minority, because actually in many countries, certainly in the US now, in the next few years, white Protestants and Catholics are going to become a minority themselves. And because there are so many minorities, the minorities actually become a majority. So I'm not really that worried about being Jewish or being, the victim of anti-Semitism, for the simple reason is that there are so many people out there who are anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, anti-Chinese, anti-Indian, anti-God knows what, that we're almost, we Jews, I don't practice Judaism, but of Jewish origin, I don't think we have to worry about it that much, because there are so many distractions to those people who want to be, who want to discriminate and who want to exercise hatred, that they've got to exercise hatred in so many different directions that they're going to just be exhausted eventually. So I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think that humankind has learned very much, but I think what has happened is that diversity has become so pervasive that it's almost impossible to repeat the mistakes of history, because the situation is so different now than it was 50 or 70 years ago.
The other area that I find fascinating, and I'm fascinated that you were part of, is Hong Kong. I've been to Hong Kong half a dozen times myself,
Yeah.
and I just love the ebb and flow of humanity. But what do you read the situation there now? Where is it going to go?
Well, look, I haven't been back to Hong Kong for about 10 years. I used to visit regularly, although I still have a nephew who lives in Hong Kong, is married to a Chinese woman.
But you know what?
When you're in Hong Kong, it's interesting. When you're in Hong Kong, politics is not a big factor. I mean, there are, of course, political issues going on, and there is a lot of suppression, political activists. But the majority of Hong Kong, maybe 80% of the population, is just not interested in politics one way or the other.
Actually,
it's a very
it's 91% Han Chinese.
Right.
If you look at the biodiversity, all the Han Chinese dominate the population.
Right.
I mean, I haven't been back. As a matter of fact, the last time I was there I actually bumped into Patton, who's the governor. And I did actually find Patton's view of what would happen to be rather naive. But then I was never a great fan of Patton as a politician. So my view then. Do you think that we were naive to sort of think the Chinese are any sort of affirmations that they would give towards freedoms?
Well, you know what? Listen, we've had my great friend Philip Bowring. We've had I know very well. Did you ever know Philip Bowring?
No.
Well, he was a great friend of mine, a great friend, and his wife is Chinese, and she's in jail now. and he did a program for us.
Yeah.
Because when I worked for the Financial Times, they owned a magazine in Hong Kong, and the editor, Derek Davis, said, "Have you got anybody who could become a business editor for me?" And because my master said that we want sort of a business editor, and I got the job, and that led to all kinds of things. But the whole thing about Hong Kong, what were I told? When I found out various things about Hong Kong, then I got very, very worried, and I'd like to be worried because Philip's wife, Claudia Moo, I think it was called, she's been in jail for the past 2 years.
What was the magazine that they owned, Stuart?
Far East Economic Review.
Oh yeah, I worked for them for a while, one summer,
Yeah.
under a guy called Derek Davis, who you probably know.
Yes. Yeah, he's a great guy. I loved it. But you see, what I remember that Philip Bowring, his great-grandfather, was the Bowring that started off the opium trade by sending a boat up the Pearl River. Right? So the thing about it was that it was very difficult to find out about the persecution of Claudia.
But let me revisit my question, because I've got two experts here. Albeit neither of you or neither of any of us have been back to Hong Kong recently. But status quo is not a word that I accept as part of life. The status quo in Hong Kong will not stay the status quo. Where do you see, Richard? Perhaps let Richard answer, and then perhaps you would give you, Stuart. Is where do you see Hong Kong going in 10 years?
You know, obviously, it's anyone's guess, but whatever happens to Hong Kong will be dependent on what goes on in China. I personally believe, maybe it's wishful thinking, I personally believe that in 10 years, China may be a very different place than it is today. Just like the Soviet Union, came apart in the 1990s, I would not be surprised if China comes apart in the next 10 years. It may not, break up into a lot of different countries, but I think the centrifugal pressures there, the regional pressures, are so great and will increase as the economy develops. As the economy develops, inevitably, there'll be stronger calls and stronger demands for participation by the population.
But there may be a finance war, you see. When the China, that all the peasants and all those of peasants and so forth and so on, put their monies under the mattress, and that meant they had about 13 trillion, whatever it was, yen, trillion dollars. It came out as 13, I think, trillion dollars. But to invest, because the Americans at that stage were very, very short of certain things. So you've got really an economic war which China can't particularly win, because they haven't got the money to actually get the weapons and so forth and so on.
Perhaps, Richard, I could just stay with you before going back to Stuart. I interviewed a Chinese when I was in Hong Kong, and my question is fairly simplistic, but I said, you've gone from a bicycle economy to a motor car economy. And he said, yes, I've got a motorbike. And I said, could you ever go back to a bicycle economy? And he said, no, we would never accept it. And essentially, what he was doing was he's voicing a new middle class of China. Now, the middle classes traditionally drive economies, and it was the middle class driving that economy. What I'm really quite anxious to find out from both of you is, how do you think that the middle class is going to affect China and Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, you see, whenever he sort of goes up to see Putin about various things, he seems to be a bit nervous to me, because there's something he doesn't like about Putin, but he can't tell us what it is. So maybe there's some flaw somehow. That he might be saying to himself, China does not want to bloody go and have arms to actually support Ukraine, so forth and so on. So the thing about it is that China, well, look at Taiwan. Everybody says they're going to invade Taiwan. They haven't. Why? Because Taiwan makes chips. It makes chips for computers. And so then Taiwan won't get done, because there's so much money that it's bringing in.
Well, I have a slightly different view of that, Stuart. I think Taiwan is more useful to the Communist Chinese Party as a whipping dog and as something they can complain about to unite the population of mainland China. And if they take over Taiwan, they will no longer have, that target, if you like, to complain about. So my feeling is, and I think I know this from having lived many years amongst Chinese, is there's a lot of talk, but Chinese culture is very reluctant to take action beyond talk on controversial issues like that. So I'm optimistic about Taiwan continuing to exist separately, because the status quo is actually working to everyone's advantage. So my feeling is that when the middle class, to answer Keith's original question, when the middle class gets more and more powerful, which they will, and wealthy, they're going to want to have a say in what happens in their surroundings, in their city, in their town, in their province. And I think that this will cause really unopposable, unassailable forces that would pull China apart rather than bring it together. I mean, China is such a huge country, like India, like the former Soviet Union, that the tendency is to move apart and decentralize rather than to centralize. And I think that the Communist Party of China is fighting a losing battle if they think they can hold all these elements together, because the more the economy improves, the more power goes to the middle class and to local and regional authorities. And this will make it, I think, impossible one day to rein in all the opposing entities. And that includes Hong Kong, that includes Taiwan. They all want to be independent, or at least autonomous, if not independent.
I found it very interesting that the good, comfortable, middle-class Brit, 2 weeks ago, it was suggested you might have to go to war. Wow! Go to war? I wonder just how much the middle-class comfort, and I think you're partly answering that, is going to affect the actions of the Chinese, and for that matter, the Russians.
Yeah. Anyway,
we welcome Philip back.
yeah.
Yes, I've listened with huge interest, Richard, to your very articulate views, and I hope Stuart doesn't mind me barging in for the last few minutes. I really do hope that your views on Trump, if they manage to convict him at least the once, that will hopefully trigger the end of him. I think the world, with a few exceptions, would be very grateful for that. Certainly this man would. Another of our guests that I talk to most Mondays is a chap who lives in Normandy now. He's a Brit, but he knows Canada and the USA like the back of his hand. And he has offered his opinions on this as well. He completely echoes your views on democracy's great fault in allowing in the extremists.
Right.
He completely agrees with you. And his view is identical to yours, that Trump, sidles up to the Putins and the Kim Jong-uns, whichever one it is, and so on, thinking they're his mates, but they're not.
No.
And I love your phrase. Did you say a convenient idiot?
What was it again? Useful idiots.
A useful idiot. So I'm encouraged by your view on that, but I can take the despair, but I can't take the hope. I just hope that is what comes to pass, because I think he's a terrible creature. I really do. So, Richard, you're actually talking to us from Connecticut.
Actually, I'm in the south of France right now, but I'm
Oh,
usually in Connecticut. Yes.
Right. So is it nice and warm and sunny?
It certainly is. It's beautiful outside. Can't wait to get outside.
Well, it's up to Stuart when we let you go, but I'm here to turn everybody off as you wish, Stuart.
Well, I think I finished.
Okay,
Now, Richard, what the result of this is, if you go to YouTube, you can get a video of it, can't you?
Oh yes, yeah.
If
You
you
can
do
watch this interview on YouTube or Facebook.
Yeah, and you can get it on a video.
Well, I look forward to seeing that, perhaps playing it back again to remind myself of all the stupid things I've said.
Au contraire.
Anyway, Stuart, I will be in England next week. If you want to have a second episode of this discussion, I've certainly enjoyed this discussion very much. And I don't know what your program schedules are, but I'd be happy to return if you feel that it would be worthwhile to have a second discussion along these lines.
Yeah.
I've certainly enjoyed myself very well, and thank you very much for including me.
That's all.
Well, we're delighted to have you, Richard. We are a bunch of esoteric people. The boundaries that confine places like the BBC and ITV do not confine us. We can do what the hell we like. So we would be very happy to have you back.
Oh, I'll tell you something. Do you know the Green Party shop down the road?
Yes.
I went in there and I said, can you tell me where I can get hold of Zoe Nicholson, because I want to actually bring her to account about the mess he's making of the town. And it's a bloke there. I said, you have to write a letter. I said, really? But I can't write. What? Anyway, I've got a little thing here which you've got to fill in and explain why that the Lewis.
Well, I don't think Richard's got much idea of what you're actually talking about, and I don't blame him.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
It's a local thing.
with your permission, I'm going to end the programme and with thanks to you both. Okay.
All right.
Enjoy the sunshine, Richard.
Yeah. Okay. See you next.